Okay. Good evening, everyone. Great crowd, standing room only. Uh, Must be the week before Thanksgiving. So I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order and ask everyone to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and remain standing for a moment of silence.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Madam Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Councilmember Walsh.
Here.
Councilmember Bullen.
Here.
Councilmember Motney.
Here.
Councilmember Becker.
Here.
Councilmember Urban.
Here.
Councilmember Ward.
Here.
Councilmember Crable.
Here.
Councilmember Crumpler.
Here.
Mayor Milewambwe.
Here. The next item on the agenda is public comment. Madam Clerk, do we have any public comment?
We did not receive any emailed public comment or anyone to register to speak in person or remote.
Okay, well, awesome. So we're gonna move ahead to the next item. And we have no recognition or appointments. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and continue on with the theme, nothing on the consent agenda?
I shouldn't say I wish, but no, I'm just teasing.
Okay.
3 items on the consent agenda. And there was one note that I wanted to publicly make.
Sure.
We've just got 3 sets of minutes and there was an error that was found in item 7B, which is applicable to October 17th Committee of the Whole meeting minutes. That edit was made. It was really just a wrong person saying the wrong thing, really. And so we made that edit earlier today and distributed the updated minutes to council. And so if you choose to push these items forward for approval, if we could do 7B as amended, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so is there a motion to approve the consent agenda containing item 7A, B, and C, and with B as amended?
I'll move. Second.
Okay, motion by Councilmember Ward and second by Councilmember Bullen. And we have a link, correct?
Now we have a link.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, the consent agenda passes. There are no nays to announce. The next item on the agenda is regular agenda, consideration action to approve the 2022 tax levy estimate for the city of Bloomington and the Bloomington Public Library as requested by the Finance Department. And I'm going to turn it over to City Manager Gleason for introductory remarks.
Very brief, Mayor and Council, but to the community regarding our property tax levy. Statutorily, this has captured what the requirements are for any given municipality in the state of Illinois. And this is the first step with a couple in between, but final adoption is proposed for December 12th. Scott?
Thank you, City Manager, Mayor, Council. As Tim mentioned, statutorily, we have to submit a final levy to the county clerk by the last Tuesday, working Tuesday in December, the calendar year. And then statutorily as well, we have to present an estimate. It has to be adopted 20 days prior to the final. So that always puts us kind of in this mid-November timeframe. So assessments are being made throughout the year. We start reaching out to the county assessor late September, early October to get a feel for where the EAVs, the equalized assessed value, is coming in. Basically, an equalized assessed value is 1/3 of the full value of the properties for the taxing district. And then from there, we calculate, basically what revenues we can realize if the EAV has gone up. And from there, the the requested revenues divided into the EAV determines the rate. Before we get into the presentation, I want to make a couple comments that tax levy needs, they kind of vary depending on the local government or entity. The city of Bloomington, it's a major component of our revenue structure, about 20%, but we have a lot of diverse revenue streams that go along with that. The Bloomington Public Library is completely dependent on the tax levy. From a financial model perspective, I look at it as an equilibrium. As inflation increases, hopefully the values of the properties within the community increase as well, and the levies that we can realize from a flat tax rate go up to keep that financial model equilibrium in balance. So inflation occurs, values occur, the revenues increase as the costs increase to keep that equilibrium basically in balance. As everyone knows, inflation has been very rampant this past year, over 8%. So it's been a significant component looking forward in the next year. One last comment before we move into it. The syncing of the budget cycle for the city and the tax levy, it always puts it right at the front end of our budget cycle. So it's a little bit on the front side. The library has adopted their budget. They don't have quite as many moving parts as we do with capital projects and things of that nature, but it is kind of early in the city's structure cycle. Next slide, please. So the EAV for our taxing district for the Bloomington area came in at $2,063,700,000. Typically, we haircut the EAV we use when we're producing the tax levy estimate and the associated rate. So we took about $5 million off that to get a $2,058,750,000 EAV for 2022. As you can see on this slide, that's a very significant value increase for the year. The hope is, that there's a widening of the tax base along with, vertical assessments. So a lot of new construction has occurred in the area. We don't have a good way of getting that split, but I think everyone's aware, that we're very fortunate within city of Bloomington and Normal for the strong employment activity we have, the build outs with Rivian, Ferrero, et cetera, and the associated construction that we're seeing from that. Next slide, please. So what the city and the library are proposing is that we realize that EAV increase, the revenues related to that, while still maintaining a flat tax rate. As you can see on here, and we'll dig into these details in just a moment, the city could realize an extra $1.4 million in tax levy revenues with actually a slight rate decrease at this point in time. And what we're proposing at the city level is to restrict all of that towards public safety pensions. The library has split their levy into two components. I'm going to skip to the second one first. The library debt service related to the expansion. Last year when we did the estimate, it was late fall. The interest rate environment was a lot different than it was when we closed on the bond. With inflation, the Federal Reserve started increasing the rates, and the final rate on the bond ended up being significantly greater than our estimate initially. So we're having to add about $235,000 just to meet that debt service. And then the library, to cover inflationary needs, is seeking the $168,000 in operations related to covering cost of inflation, which we have on there for 8%, et cetera. Next slide, please. So for the city first, this exhibit highlights where we are with our public safety pensions. And the contribution as calculated by our actuaries for police and fire for next year is $12.3 million. We have currently, with the existing levy and existing budget, $8.2 million. This is the first column here in tax levy, utility tax revenues, which is associated with a tax increase that was put into place in 2016 or so. It's approximately $2.3 million. So you can see we have about $10.5 million in current restricted revenues. So that leaves about a $1.8 million shortfall. If we add in the full levy increase, the $1.4 million, restrict that to the pensions, demonstrate our commitment to addressing that pension obligation, that 100% funding status by 2040, you can see that we'll still have about a $400,000 shortfall in the far right column. But we can significantly address it with these restricted revenues. And then, as I said, this demonstrates a commitment not only to the community, but to rating agencies, our bond holders, et cetera, that we're serious about meeting that pension obligation. Next slide, please. This is the detail of our levy categories that we submit to the county. So over time, these have developed for one reason or another. I know since I've been here, the fire protection amount has gone up related to an additional crew for ambulance services. But the only one that typically varies is the bond and interest can go up and down dependent on the debt service needs for the coming year for the city. And that will be offset to the general corporate revenues. So that's our general corporate revenues gets posted to the general fund, is utilized. You know, we have $120 million general fund budget for this coming year. As you can see, $22 million, $20 million last year, 20.9 million. It's a significant portion, but it doesn't cover it in total. So what we're looking at this year is adding the full 1.4 million to the fire pension and the police pension. That's why we have those bolded. So $1.4 million add, 6.69% increase in the total levy amount. But you can see across the bottom that, you know, our rates really have stayed pretty constant over the last few years. And this year we're actually looking at a slight decrease. One other point I wanted to add is that, you know, with the inflation that, you know, the plus 8% inflationary impact, you know, that's going to be hitting the city as well as the library. And what we're submitting and proposing with this, dedicating these revenues to the police fire pensions is that, you know, we'll be making the rest of that increase up from the revenue, other source revenues within the general fund. Next slide, please. So with this, I'm going to kick it over to Jeannie to cover the library need.
Scott covered a lot of what you need to know already, but I just wanted to reiterate a few things. We do our budget process a little differently than the city. So we've already created our budget as a supporting document for you to support why we're asking for this levy amount. You'll also see that library expansion proposed tax levy, that really isn't negotiable since that's the debt service that we have to pay. So we have looked really hard at the library operations and have tried to be very good fiscal stewards of the taxpayer dollars. We've tried to estimate inflation so that we have enough to cover the operational needs, but also tried to be very realistic so that we're not asking for more and transferring a burden to the taxpayers. So you'll see there, we are asking for the rate to stay the same.
Thank you, Jeannie. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of the city and library combined. They are separate levies, but this kind of highlights, you know, how we present our levy typically to the community. And, you know, at the bottom line there is really showing, you know, that we've maintained, other than the increase last year in rate related to the library expansion, I tried to maintain our rate consistently over time. Now, we will acknowledge, you know, as values increase, if a house gets reassessed, property gets reassessed with the rate staying the same, the tax component or the tax liability will go up. But this is the way we have to kind of like demonstrate, you know, the holding of our taxing activity related to this constant rate. Next slide, please. These numbers are based on last year's final, so it shows 2022 tax levy, but the rates are not final for the year. This is our ongoing exhibit that shows how for our taxing district, a dollar bill would be split up. These are not the actual tax rates. For example, District 87, a total tax rate is about 5.17%. The city's is 1.08%. But this gives a visual for that split of the dollar for District 87 taxing district. Next slide, please. And then we realize that some of our residents reside in the Unit 5 district. So this highlights the split for the dollar bill for Unit 5. Unit 5 being 63 cents on the dollar. Their tax rate was about 5.61% last year. The total for that district was 8.94%. The total for the District 87 was about 8.5%. Next slide, please. So since we are proposing to take up our aggregate dollar amount, the levy, more than 5%, not the rate, By statute, we are required to have a truth and taxation hearing. The City of Bloomington aggregate increases around 6.69%, and the Bloomington Public Library aggregate increases around 6.86%. Next slide, please. And due to that need, this will be the schedule rolling forward, giving the vote this evening. So truth and taxation public hearing notices will be published in the Pantograph for the City of Bloomington and the Bloomington Public Library on the 28th. The plan, truth and taxation hearings will be for December 5th, and then the final adoption of the levy on December 12th. Next slide, please. And that concludes the presentation. So questions? Comments?
Okay. Do we have any questions? Council? Okay, Councilmember Monty.
Sure. Yeah, I have a few questions, but starting first, with your slide 10, your slide 10 really kind of articulates the potential impact on the public here. When you think about home ownership and inflating property values, it only benefits that homeowner or the renter who's paying towards someone else's mortgage if they dispose of their property through sales during that time frame, because otherwise, they have an unrealized appreciation that could very much start to fall. And some are saying already is starting to fall here with interest rates slowing down home sales for reselling properties. So you mentioned, Scott, that there's no really good way to delineate what is growth in the expanding tax base here versus, I think you called it vertical growth. Other than, certainly anecdotally, I'm hearing from a lot of people who receive tax bills that included, that increase of their assessed value, which impacts them to the tune of whatever that number is. So on average, almost 7%. Is there anything even directionally that you have that helps us understand that simple pie chart between what really is EAV growth from, kind of the expanding economy here versus what is the net valuation change for existing property owners?
On the prelim EAV reports, we do have a numerical number of parcels, and it shows, I think I'm doing this from memory, 85 to 90 new parcels for the year. Now, whether or not, they're also removing old parcels as they go along, but that's about all the information I have at this point.
And what is that a factor of? How many parcels do we have in total?
Cool. I'm not really sure at this point.
It would probably be, tens of
Thousands, right?
Right.
Thousands.
So, in terms of that net and just thinking of new growth, which often comes with, some incentives and things like that. I mean, really, I guess my point is the majority of this EAV increase is going to be felt by the everyday, property owner or renter who is paying, for existing properties. I'm making that assumption, and I want to make sure that is a reasonable thought process for me to be using in evaluating this decision.
Yeah, as we discussed, if the average, if you talk averages, if the average went up 6%, then an average increase, if you put in those terms, would be applied to those homes.
Yeah. And hence, that's why the whole truth and taxation hearing process is being tripped here, because if we were reducing our rate to make, for example, this EAV increase under 5%, we would not be going through this process in these next few weeks. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the truth in taxation is based on the dollar amount. So the dollar amount of the levy itself as opposed to the rate, but yes.
Okay. So the backdrop that I'm thinking about too in this is two specific things. One is the surplus that we currently have. That is sitting out there. The second piece is, being fresh from the financial presentation last week. roughly $4 million annually that we're seeing as a result of the online purchase taxation and whatever that amount is attributed to cannabis, which I understand we can't be told that number explicitly, but those two numbers, according to the auditor, are roughly 4 million annually. Is that right?
I won't say according to the auditor, those are my numbers. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So when I think about that and then stepping back and just focusing on the city's portion for a moment, we have 4 million coming in over here that is effectively new revenue toward the city. In this case, we're earmarking for an EAV increase of almost 7% and then attributing that at 1.4 million earmarking for public safety pensions. Is that correct?
That's the proposal, the 1.4 million for
Okay.
public safety. pensions.
So I guess, my point in bringing that up is, on the one hand, we can look at this as this is the right thing to do because we're earmarking this for public safety pensions, and that's just kind of an appropriate thing to do. But on the other hand, I have this, information that we've shared here in the last few weeks that we have that $4 million coming in, and we also have amassed a pretty significant amount of reserves that we could be drawing on to close that gap without needing to effectively increase the taxes here on the people who live in Bloomington at a time when they are suffering from the same 8% inflation, if that makes sense. We've got other sources to close that gap. I guess that's my point.
If I may make two comments, I guess, so the additional revenues that I've been referencing for the last, 12 months, I think, approximately, those have been incorporated like in FY 23. So, we have grown staff. There's been additional inflation since then. So I just want to make sure that the framework isn't that there's just $4 million available, because that has been utilized in the existing budget. And there's discussions about utilizing it for additional road expenditures and things of that nature. The other comment I would make is that cautionary about the use of reserves for operations. Typically, reserves are utilized for, one-time like if we wanted to address a large capital expenditure need, like a fire station or things of that nature. Or if we wanted to do a one-time deposit to the pension funds to try to lower the future contribution requirement. Typically using reserves to plug holes, ongoing holes for operations is viewed negatively by creditors and GFOA and things of that nature.
Well, a few years ago, when the decision was made to close the gap on an existing structural deficit, there was a funding source identified, which has driven, a lot of this increase in reserves, that being the sales tax increase that was specifically geared toward that. So I guess, I'm just putting that out there as like a backdrop. I certainly acknowledge that the city government is also impacted by inflation. I 100% understand that. I'm just trying to, talk through earnestly what is the right thing to do when the people we are serving in this community are also impacted by all of these factors, and they don't have access to the levers we do to make decisions, to close that gap at a personal level. So how do we find that balance in this and make sure, as we're looking at a very complicated math problem here, that we're doing so, just really also too considering the shoes of these people we're serving? And can we, for this period, if this EAV truly is going to start falling within a short period of time here, does it make sense for us to reflect on the magnitude of this decision now and maybe take this number, down a little bit, just to help, again, acknowledge that this inflation and the environment that we're in today is significantly impacting the residents. So setting aside the city and then coming over to the library. So about a year ago, right around now, we got the great news that a grant was received for, I think, $5.68 million. And half of that was applied toward the principal of this project, if that is correct.
Project.
But half of it was applied toward the project as it was scoped for
Sure.
approval by the council, correct?
Sure. Yes.
And then half of it was set aside for amenities that had previously been cut from the proposal. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
So effectively, so just reflecting again on the cost structure around all of this. So 5.68 million in the grant, half of that being 2.84 million. And so had we reduced the bonding amount by that 2.84 million, it appears that the net return back to the taxpayers, if you will, and reduce cost and tax burden on them would be about $3.78 million over the horizon of this project. I just want to make sure that this is tracking as I try to work through the decision process that we're asked, to work through here tonight. Does that make sense? So you've got the 2.84 million that was set aside for the buyback of amenities that had previously been cut. Had that 2.84 million been used to reduce the bond price would have been reduced by 2.84 million. Plus, then there would have been another reduction for the equivalent of the increased cost of funds over the 20 years for that 2.84 million reduction. I just want to make sure that my math is making sense.
But I'll let you guys. So following your math and your logic, I think that logic would only hold if those dollars weren't needed, though. I mean, if they still need them to execute the project, then that becomes the whole discussion of borrowing or lowering the overall total cost. I mean, so you could apply that theory to a larger number in that case.
So Scott, the reason in reflecting back and looking at prior meeting minutes and prior meeting discussions is that 2.84 million in our dialogue was not offsetting inflation. It was specifically being discussed to purchase back amenities that the proposal had already determined could be cost reductions. Is that accurate?
To a certain extent, yes, it is. It sort of depends upon how you define cutting amenities. Some of those were things like the parking deck that council basically said, we really need and want this. So yes, the project could have been smaller, but as directed by council in consultation, the city council and the library board, we came up with a package that we really strongly believe then, and we still strongly believe is the right size and is the right project. I'd also point out that if we had done this 6 months earlier, had the council, seen fit to do this a little bit earlier, our bond rate would be lower and the rates would be lower then. So in hypotheticals, yes, indeed, it is possible we could do less, but that would not be what the council wanted. It would not be what the library board wanted. And I would argue it's not what the citizens really deserve.
Okay.
Well, I believe
Can I,
you're
can
correct.
can you give
in
me a
that-
quick second here? And how much time do we have left? Because I know,
I have us showing, well, they're giving you the time right there, 10 minutes and some
Okay.
odd seconds.
sounds good.
Thank
All
you.
right.
So-
And we have what, 1, 2, 3, 4? Okay. All right.
I will make, this is a very important decision relative to the people who reside here. So I've researched this and I want to make sure I'm tracking in making this decision. I agree with you. The council did approve that, including the parking garage. However, this 2.84 million was in addition to that.
I still would say the council approved it because the council approved the $14.2 million bond at that time, knowing that we had this grant because if you remember, we were asking, I think, a $17 million bond and it was reduced at that time to a $14 million bond.
No, I agree that the council did approve it. I'm just saying that in times of challenge, whether you're an individual or whether you are an institution, a governmental institution, you know, we all have to reflect on what should we do now with the information that we have. And in that case, that $2.84 million, according to that meeting that we had, was going to be set aside for amenities that were not part of what we voted on when we approved the package.
I do not believe that interpretation is correct. I think that we did not add anything to the package beyond what the council had approved. I mean, there were some things that earlier in the process, before that grant was secured, that we were talking to the council, negotiating on reducing. And when we got the grant, and getting the grant allowed us to both reduce the bond and to increase the project back to where the council collectively decided it should be. And I think that's what happened. It was not an extra that we stuck on top of what the council approved.
Jeannie, is that how you
Yes.
saw it?
Yes, that's how I would see it. And because I saw the council approving the project when they approved the bond, which
So-
was the $14.2 million bond. With that understanding, that whole package was presented at that meeting. And also, just to clarify, the grant does require a match. And we've
Right.
also fundraised, so I would be wary I'm not sure what you're asking here, but if you're asking us to reduce anything in the project, I'd be wary to do that because we have committed to
Mhm.
those funders.
Not at all. And I have your documents that lay all of that out. So I'm very familiar with those requirements. What I'm talking about is the gap that you need to close now and the 2.84 million from the grant that was carved out of what we voted on. It was not included in here based on reviewing the meeting. That was set aside for you, and everyone voted on this. So I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with this. I'm just saying that this is the process that we used, and that $2.84 million was set aside for the renewal of some things that you were looking to do. I think that was the testimony at the time.
Again, I would say was not set aside and added back into the final project the council approved, included the entire scope that the council approved at that time. You are implying, I believe, that this was some sort of extra that was added back in after or separate from the process, and that is not the case.
I don't mean to imply that. So if I did, I've misspoken and I apologize for that. I'm not saying that anything was added back into something that we voted on. What I'm saying that it was my understanding that 50% of the grant money was going to be put in a separate bucket for the potential amenities that were not included in the package that was provided to us. And the reason I bring this up is, again, we're looking at, on a percentage basis, a material tax increase for our residents. And I'm just looking at what else might we be able to do to offset the cost imposition here for the taxpayers in Bloomington in a period of unprecedented inflation in my adult lifetime. What more can we do? That's all I'm
Okay.
asking, which I think is
Understood.
my duty in response to serving
Understood
the
and
public.
appreciated. I don't think that they're separate buckets. I mean, the entire project is one bucket. Because if we start doing that, we say, well, there's a bucket from the fundraising, and there's a bucket from our reserves, and there's a bucket from this, and each part is paying for a different part of the project. The project was scoped as a whole and funded through a variety of mechanisms. And this was not a special bucket that is somehow appropriated. We have committed this money to the entire project as approved by the council, as a package approved by the council.
Okay.
I think what you're looking at tonight is our operating budget, and none of those cover what's in the operating budget. So if we would have not gotten the grant and we cut that $2.5 million from the project, that just wouldn't happen for years to come. So I'm not sure how that impacts the levy tonight because we're talking about what our operational needs are, not what we're buying in terms of construction and furniture.
Those operational needs will include the debt service, isn't that correct? The 235,000 annually. So that's what I'm talking about. The decision, my point is this, the decision not to apply that to principal at the time. And I'll certainly go back and listen to the meeting again, just. from
Mayor,
a-
I have a point of order. This feels like we're having, I mean, like this conversation is being completely dominated by one council member
Okay.
talking about something that we've already voted on months ago. And it doesn't feel like it's on the agenda tonight.
Okay. So can you finish your sentence real quick and then we can move on?
And I appreciate that. My intentions are simply to make sure that I do the very best I can to look 360 degrees around what is going to be felt as a very significant tax increase by the residents of Bloomington. That's my intention. And in stepping back and looking at all of the moving parts and understanding how those moving parts might be leveraged differently to mitigate what we're going to be going through and asking our public to pay here in the coming few weeks.
Okay.
And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I think in the order that I had seen them, Councilmember Bolin, Ward, and Crable.
I listened to what Sheila said and I kind of understand and everything. One of the things that I've experienced, which kind of bothers me, and Scott, you addressed that, is that we have to determine the levy before we have our budget set. So we don't know really all the moving parts and what we can address, what we can decrease, that kind of thing within the budget. We kind of have to go in blind, sort of. Okay. Anyway. Thank you for putting the Unit 5 picture up there because I think it is important. It doesn't make that much of a difference, but yeah, about half the community is in Unit 5. So thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Ward.
Yeah, I want to just say thank you to all the work that's been put into this entire presentation and particularly the efforts that have been put into the work on the library presentation. I too am quite passionate about the needs of our citizens and residents of this community. And the library serves so many purposes. One of the most recent things that I posted on my city council Facebook page had to do with the library being a warming center. And over the last few days, that's been particularly relevant. And so I can't say thank you enough for your patience and continued steadfastness to the people of our community who are affected by hard times. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Crable.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I'll first say, I learned this early on in my tenure, and the mayor and Donna would remember this. I ask a lot of questions. So I learned and to, as much as possible, ask those questions in advance because staff is readily able to answer those in a timely manner. And I'll just say, we are all concerned about the burden on taxpayers, and we all are fiduciaries for the city to make sure it's financially sound. Just a couple confirming things, Scott. The assessed value has increased, which increases property taxes, even if all the rates of the taxing bodies stay the same. Is that?
Well, yeah, that's where you get into these conversations because some properties did not get reassessed. So their rates will stay the same or their tax amount will stay the same. But if their properties got reassessed, their tax amount will go up. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, in other words, the amount of property taxes people will pay are not caused by any rate increase for us this year. The
That's
rate
correct.
is staying the same.
That's true.
Okay. And we don't have any control over assessed value.
That's true.
Okay. Also, we previously used the utility tax. And we're now putting that on property taxes. Is that a better way to do it?
It's more consistent, you know, the levy is pretty much a certain revenue amount. Utility tax is variable. So from that standpoint, it's a better resource for the pensions.
And so the utility tax has gone down over time. Did we anticipate that at the beginning?
Did we anticipate that at the beginning when we first approved the
For-
tax?
Right, to use the utility tax. Did we think it
I
would?
was
go-
not here then, but I assume no, that it was not anticipated.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Walsh.
Do we need to extend time first?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to propose something?
I'd like to make a motion that we extend the time by 10 minutes, please.
I'll second.
A second, okay. Voice vote?
Yes. Councilmember Walsh,
Yes.
Councilmember Bolin,
Yes.
Councilmember Motney,
Yes.
Councilmember Becker,
Yes.
Councilmember Urban, Councilmember Ward,
Aye.
Councilmember Crable,
Yes.
Councilmember Crumpler.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I just have a few questions. You have mentioned that we don't know on the widening tax base. And I don't really understand that. We know how many, I'm gonna say building permits have gone out for new construction and things like that. We've got a fabulous IT department. I don't understand why we can't pull those numbers out of the system and say, this is how much it's widened and get a pretty fair estimate on that number.
That's fair enough. We could probably get an estimate, whether or not those those projects have been completed, et cetera, and included in the values from the county. I mean, it would just be more of a project, but we can incorporate that into next year.
Okay. My next question in your presentation here, in the numbers specifically for the city of Bloomington. I mean, we've got the fire pension, we've got the police pension. And we obviously have legal obligations on both of those too. One other thing in here that's not highlighted, and I find it interesting while the fire pension and the police pension are highlighted, general corporate is not highlighted with the increase on there for general corporate. And the increase in general corporate from last year's to this year's is going from 3.3 million up to 4.1 million, an increase of $834,000, which is a 24% increase. That's significant to not highlight.
Right. I tried to reference that. So we have the way the levy occurs year to year. Let's say if we maintain a constant levy amount, depending on the debt service, the top line need for the coming year, if the debt service takes a dip down and then goes back up, we'll just roll the dollars down into the general corporate line so that we don't have big changes in our overall levy. So you can see that the 1.8 million in bonds and interest went down to $970,000. So we roll that into general corporate. And then the next year, if the debt service amount increases, we push it back up. So it's kind of a fluid between those two line items.
Okay. My last question is dealing with the sales tax and with inflation and what's been happening with inflation, and knowing that our sales tax is a percentage of goods sold. I'm assuming we're going to be seeing an increase in our sales tax revenue also because of inflation.
Yes, I have tried to comment on that during the finance director's report, and that the inflation is kind of a double-edged sword. What, on one hand, it's positive for local governments related to sales tax activity. On the other hand, it's a burden to the consumer. There's a point in time where those lines kind of cross. If we hit a recession, and the activity of the consumer starts to decline, then, it will be offset by that issue, like a recession or those kinds of things.
And my last comment, and this comes down to dealing with inflation on this. And it's the mindset of something that we need to focus on and look at. And that is the fact that in like the business I'm in, which happens to be a private business, you know, we've been reminded over and over again by our executives that yes, inflation is high, but I'm not going to get a raise based upon the amount of inflation. Because if we did that, there might be years where I would get a 1% raise or a 0.5% raise. And then there's going to be years like this where I would get an 8% raise. And that's not how the business world operates, that they don't just get to go raise taxes. And yes, we're not raising taxes, but in reality, we are. We are raising taxes here with this proposal, because unless I go and sell my home, I have an unrealized gain. I'm not going to see that any gain at all because I choose to stay in my home. And so, you know, the business world doesn't have the mechanics that we do to go, we need more money. Well, let's go dip into the taxpayers' pockets. That doesn't work. If a business needs more revenue, they have to increase prices on people, which may impact their sales, or they have to lay people off, which may impact their sales and their service. And so there's things that I see consistently, and being the baby on the council here, I see consistently with government in general that we could just raise taxes. And that's not how the rest of the world works. And I think we need to be conscious of that. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Crumpler. and then
Thank you,
Baker.
Mayor. Thank you, everyone, Scott, Julian, Jeannie, for coming and talking to council tonight. Thank you for reminding us that you reduced, you know, the bond amount from 17 down to 14 million previously. Also, Jeannie, would it be fair to say that you've gone through your budget and looked at every possible way, you know, to reduce operating costs, you know, to make the functioning of our library leaner and efficient as part of this project?
We have, in fact, the library board approved a budget in October, and then based on feedback that we had from council members, we went back and reduced that budget, and the library board approved a revised budget in November.
Okay, well, you know, I think in my view, the library particularly has done its part in this project, and I appreciate, you know, your fiscal responsibility, trying to make sure that the library remains something that's vital in our community, yet does its best to run on a, you know, economically efficient way. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Baker.
I'll be quick. Scott knows I've kind of made this point a couple times, and I just want to kind of reiterate it for folks, is that in my belief, in every discussion that I've had, I believe the EAV is artificially inflated. So this year or the next 2 years, whatever, till that average comes back down, people are going to pay more, but get nothing in return for them. And so rather than deal with taking that extra tax revenue, my perspective would be reducing the budget a little bit and using some of the reserves. Now, I agree with you 100% as a financial guy, Scott. Taking reserves and putting them in an operational recurring thing, you're taking one-time revenue and putting it in a recurring thing could leave you in a bad spot down the road. Except for the fact that I believe, I'm going to use you against you. You're smart enough to know how to manage the budget and work things through. I believe we can do that given the size of the surplus that we have. I believe we have discussion coming up that says we need to look at how we're going to use some of that surplus too. So I would just like to consider, everybody to consider that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think at this point, we're gonna go ahead with a motion.
I'll move that we approve it.
Okay, motion by Councilmember Ward. Is there a second?
I'll make a second to that motion.
Okay, second by Councilmember Urban. Can we Okay, so the item passes. There are 3 nays to announce, it looks like, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Walsh, Councilmember Becker, and Councilmember Miney.
Thank you. I believe the next item on the agenda, I think Scott has had enough being here, so we're not gonna have you on this next one, right? This was a scrivener's error. Is that what it's called? Okay, awesome. I like that word, scrivener. So the report will be given on November 28th. So you're off the hook. Act more excited. And we're gonna move on to city manager's discussion.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. 3 slides, I believe. Phil, this is the first one. Small Business Saturday. We've talked about this in the past couple of meetings, but truly the kickoff is this Saturday. It's the Saturday, always the Saturday after Thanksgiving. So it's the opportunity to shop small and support our local businesses. Next slide. 44th Annual Turkey Trot. That's this Thursday at Miller Park, 8 a.m. Plenty of time to come out before the Thanksgiving festivities on the home front. And the Ugliest Sweater Run, Saturday, December 3rd at Miller Park. I think the deputy city manager will win that again. And 3rd slide, please. New employees. We do this typically at this meeting, which is the committee of the whole. We have Sarah Lang that's been hired, Ashley Sidek, Josh Johnson, Jennifer Smith, Regina Ross, and Ashley Lara. And lastly, just want to say to the community, happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy time with friends and family. Thank you.
And on the mayor's report, everything important deserves to be said twice. So I'm gonna say happy Thanksgiving as well. Council, do you have comments?
I just have one real quick.
Sure.
I noticed we had a new hire there for the arts and entertainment department. Do we have an overall idea of what we're gonna be looking at for a budget for the arts and entertainment department?
That's definitely going to be a part of the FY24 discussion. Know that we are going to track below the cost when we were outsourcing it, just like we had communicated to the community and council.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, it doesn't look like we have any other comments. So is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Okay, motion by Councilmember Bolin, second by Councilmember Becker. All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Okay, we are adjourned.